The courier arrived at midnight. Rain hammered the slate roof of the Abwehr safe house on the outskirts of Berlin as the young intelligence runner stumbled inside, boots soaked, uniform clinging to his skin. He didn't bother saluting. He simply thrust a sealed pouch toward Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of German military intelligence, with the urgency of a man carrying the weight of a nation's delusions. Inside the envelope lay a report so astonishing, so mathematically horrifying, that even Canaris paused before reading. Its author, a deep-cover industrial operative recently returned from the United States, had risked everything to deliver a single message: that the Ford Motor Company, operating at full wartime tempo, was producing 1.5 million individual parts per hour. Not per day, per hour. Canaris read the number again. It felt unreal. A statistic ripped from a futurist fantasy, not a battlefield report. Yet the details were unquestionably authentic. Diagrams of conveyor systems, breakdowns of modular subassemblies, production logs copied from Detroit plant paperwork. If even half of it was true, Germany's dream of a long war was over. He handed the papers to his chief analyst. The man's face drained of color. But the greatest shock came at dawn when Canaris presented the intelligence to the senior leadership of the Reich. He did not expect gratitude. Military truth was rarely welcomed, but he expected seriousness. Instead, he received only silence, then laughter. A general sneered that American factories are operated by mongrels and women. Another dismissed the report as enemy deception. A party official, face flushed with ideological certainty, asked how a nation of consumer simpletons could possibly outrun the industrial genius of the German people. The room concluded not with debate, but with accusation. If the report contradicted doctrine, then the report was wrong. And if Canaris brought it forward, then Canaris himself was suspect. The Abwehr was exaggerating American strength. The Abwehr was undermining morale. The Abwehr was flirting with treason. Even as the war burned hotter, truth had become a political liability. Canaris walked out of the meeting knowing the unspoken verdict. German intelligence had revealed too much reality, and reality was now incompatible with the worldview of a regime that believed industrial capacity flowed from racial destiny, not from physics, manpower, and assembly line engineering. The tragedy, the real tragedy, was not that the intelligence was ignored. It was that the intelligence was unthinkable to the men who needed it most. That night, as the Reichschancellery's lights flickered behind him, Canaris understood what the panzer generals at Kursk would later feel, what U-boat commanders in the Atlantic would soon experience, and what the German economy would ultimately collapse under. Germany was not fighting the United States of America. Germany was fighting American production, and production obeyed no ideology. The report from Ford's River Rouge complex was a cold arithmetic of modern war. Tens of thousands of machines running in synchronized loops. Molten metal poured into molds every second. Stamping presses hammering steel into form faster than German craftsmen could cut a single panel. Workers, women, immigrants, union machinists, black Americans, men too old for combat, operated with a level of efficiency the Reich had declared biologically impossible. That declaration was now killing them. For years, German spies had sent back warnings. The colossal scale of U.S. shipyards, the staggering throughput of Boeing's aircraft lines, the nightmarish volume of engine production at General Motors. Every report painted the same picture. America wasn't just outproducing Germany, it was outproducing history. But each warning collided with the ideological walls of the Nazi worldview. A worldview in which inferior races could not be superior workers. In which democratic consumer economies could not metamorphose into war machines. In which women could not replace men in factories. in which assembly line repetition was considered mentally corrosive rather than militarily decisive. So the intelligence was dismissed, again and again, and the men who delivered it paid the price. Canaris knew his warning had been buried long before he left the room. The leadership's reaction was not merely denial, it was fear, because to accept the numbers meant accepting that Nazi Germany had already lost the war by late 1942. To accept that millions of American parts flowed every hour from Detroit meant admitting that no late-war tank, no miracle weapon, no desperate counterattack could close the gap. To accept that racial ideology had blinded the Reich meant confronting the deepest lie of the regime. Better for them to accuse the messenger of treason. By sunrise, the SS had begun compiling internal dossiers on the Abwehr. Documents were seized, analysts were questioned, spies were recalled under false pretenses. A campaign of suspicion began, one that would eventually destroy the Abwehr from within. Yet the Ford report continued to haunt those few who understood its implications, because hidden inside its dry numbers was a truth that Germany's generals would only realize as their world collapsed around them. World War II was no longer a contest of the best tank or the best general. It was a confrontation between two philosophies of reality, one rooted in myth, the other rooted in measurable production. The tragedy of Canaris was the tragedy of an entire nation. The refusal to believe what was true because the truth came from the wrong kind of people. As the war dragged on, the echoes of that midnight report would grow louder. On the steppes of Ukraine, where German armor ran out of spare parts. In the skies over Germany, where swarms of American bombers filled the horizon. And in the factories of the Reich, where shortages became starvation. The men who laughed at the Ford report would one day watch their cities burn under the weight of the very production numbers they denied. And the question that would haunt history was not whether Germany could have matched American output. It couldn't. But why its leaders chose blindness over survival. Because in that moment, when science met ideology and arithmetic met delusion, Germany's fate was sealed not by defeat on the battlefield, but by refusal to see the world as it was.
Lang bevor der Ford-Report landed on Canaris' desk, lang bevor der Reich descended into paranoid whispers about treason und Sabotage, German intelligence officers hatten bemappen einen industriellen Giganten, whose capabilities defied every assumption of Nazi-Ideologie. But they faced a paralyzing contradiction. Die mehr akkurat sie reporteten amerikanische Produktion, der Leers, die Leadership, beliebte them. Am Herz der Tragödie lay eine simple Fakt, Germany could not accept. The United States hat built einen industriellen Ökosystem larger than the entire Axis war economy combined, und es war only beginning to mobilize. German analysts embedded in North America sent home figures so large they seemed fictional. They wrote of assembly lines stretching farther than Berlin's widest avenues, of foundries lit with molten steel night and day, of factories where engines, gearboxes and weapon components moved on conveyor belts that never stopped, not even for meals, not even for shift changes.
They described worker rotations so fluid that the machinery dictated human rhythm, not the other way around. But the reports struck at the very core of the Nazi worldview, that only racially superior cultures could generate superior production. And so the data bounced off walls of ideology long before they reached the desks of strategists. One Abwehr agent stationed near Detroit documented a single plant that consumed more coal, electricity, and steel in a week than some German military districts used in a month. Another reported that American factories were installing engines onto test stands faster than German factories could cast the engine blocks themselves. A third sent back blueprints of inventory systems so efficient that Ford employees could track thousands of parts simultaneously, an unimaginable system for German foremen reliant on ledgers and intuition. Yet every report was met with the same dismissive refrain: impossible, not with those workers.
Der Germane industrielle Philosophie revolte Craftsmanship, skilled labor, slow precision, master machinists guiding metal into excellence. Efficiency stemmed from human expertise. Machines assisted, they did not dictate. Und so der Germane Leadership sah amerikanische Massproduktion, standardized, modular, repetitive, nicht als einen Vorteil, sondern als kultureller Decay. Sie beliebten, industrielle Assembly Lines dulden den Mind und lowered Craftsmanship. Sie konnten nicht perceiven, dass War demanded quantity multiplied by reliability, not artisanale Perfektion. When Spice reported that the United States was producing aircraft faster than Germany could repair damaged ones, the reports were ignored. When they revealed that U.S. factories were running 3 shifts across 7 days, a continuous production cycle, Hitler mocked the idea as money-chasing Jewish nonsense.
When they documented conveyor systems capable of assembling a bomber's fuselage in hours, Goering scoffed that Americans built toys, not weapons. The ideological blinders waren total. Inside Germany, bureaucratic infighting wasn't the problem. Ministries hoarded information, industry barons exaggerated their own output, and Nazi officials routinely doctored statistics to please superiors rather than reflect reality. Meanwhile, U.S. production grew with terrifying acceleration. The Ford River Rouge complex alone, with its integrated steel mill, glassworks, and assembly plant, could deliver finished vehicles faster than Germany could coordinate rail shipments of raw steel. German intelligence recorded this transformation meticulously. German leadership burned the reports metaphorically, sometimes literally. The power of American industry was not simply its size, but its elasticity. The U.S.
The economy could absorb millions of workers, shift consumer factories to military output, and still expand agricultural production. Germany, by contrast, cannibalized its own civilian economy to sustain its war machine until both were starving. One Abwehr summary from mid-1942 estimated that the United States could triple its production of trucks by 1943. The response from Berlin was derision. Americans have no reason to build so many trucks. 6 months later, U.S. factories exceeded the projection, and German panzer divisions were immobilized by fuel and vehicle shortages in the winter crisis of 43. Intelligence failures did not stem from incompetence. They stemmed from dogma. Germany refused to believe that democratic capitalism could transform into a centralized war economy faster than Nazi Germany could. They refused to believe that a workforce including women, immigrants, and minorities could outperform racially superior German workers. They refused to believe that standardized, modularized production was the future of warfare. And most of all, they refused to believe that industrial scale could replace military superiority. As the intelligence stream grew more alarming, the Reich grew more defensive. Instead of adjusting strategy, they attacked the sources. Instead of revising expectations, they revised their truths. Instead of confronting reality, they insulated themselves from it. Inside the Abwehr, analysts sensed the danger. Months before the Ford report triggered outright accusations of treason, whispers circulated that accurate assessments of American strength were defeatist. Canaris himself urged restraint in phrasing, not because he doubted the truth, but because he feared what the truth would provoke in a leadership obsessed with ideological purity over empirical fact. The tragedy of this chapter was not that Germany lacked intelligence on American production. It was that Germany had abundant intelligence and chose blindness. In a war defined by engines, steel, and machine tools, the Reich clung to myths about destiny and bloodlines. And so, when the Ford report finally landed with its devastating arithmetic, 1.5 million parts per hour, it was not the first warning. It was merely the warning that broke the regime's fragile illusion. Instead of confronting the implications, they condemned the messenger. The tragedy of German intelligence was not only that its warnings were ignored, it was that the consequences of that blindness appeared everywhere, on the roads of the Eastern Front, in the shipyards of Kiel, in the skies over the Ruhr, and in every logistical artery of the German war machine. The deeper the war progressed, the more obvious it became that U.S. industrial output was not simply larger. It was operating on a scale so vast that German logistical doctrine could not even conceptualize it. To Canaris and his analysts, the numbers coming from America were not abstract. They were forecasts of doom. Every hour that Ford produced 1.5 million parts, every morning that General Motors built hundreds of engines, every shift that Consolidated Vultee rolled out rows of bombers, translated directly into one thing: logistical inevitability. Yet inside the Führer's headquarters, the idea that logistics, not heroism, not ideology, not will, determine the fate of nations was seen as defeatist. The Reich had crafted a myth of blitzkrieg brilliance, that rapid strikes and superior doctrine could compensate for limited resources. But blitzkrieg was not magic. It was a gamble, a short war strategy depending on shock and collapse. Once that window closed, once Germany was forced into a long attritional conflict, logistics became everything. American logistics were infinite. German logistics were finite. And intelligence had been shouting this truth for years. The Eastern Front, where production became destiny. By 1942, German panzer divisions were already feeling the invisible weight of American factories. Tanks broke down not from combat, but from lack of spare parts. Lubricants congealed in the cold. Engines overheated. Track links snapped. Crews resorted to cannibalizing their own disabled vehicles. A battalion nominally fielding 100 tanks might have only 35 operational at any given moment. Abwehr analysis showed that a single month of U.S. automotive production, just automotive, could have replaced every tank Germany lost at Stalingrad. The report was forwarded to the OKW. The margin note returned was brutal in its simplicity. Impossible, defeatist exaggeration. Yet the numbers marched on, indifferent to ideology. The Atlantic War, where shipyards became artillery. German naval intelligence learned early that American shipyards operated at a tempo inconceivable in Europe. Liberty ships launched weekly. Destroyers slid down rails monthly. Carriers appeared like clockwork. One U-boat commander, witnessing an American convoy protected by more escort vessels than Germany had deployed in an entire theater, wrote bitterly, "We are fighting an ocean, not a navy." What he did not know was that American shipyards were producing vessels faster than U-boats could sink them, sometimes faster than German yards could repair their own submarines. The Abwehr forwarded reports demonstrating that U.S. ship production would render unrestricted submarine warfare untenable by 1943. The reply from Berlin was predictable. American morale will collapse before then. It did not. The Air War, when quantity became air superiority. The most devastating intelligence came from American aircraft factories. The U.S. produced bombers with terrifying regularity, B-17s and B-24s emerging in long, shining rows.
German spies sent back photographs of assembly lines with wings suspended like industrial forests, fuselages creeping along conveyor rails, engines stacked in pyramids. Luftwaffe officers refused to believe it. Not until the sky itself proved the reports true, until formations of 1,000 American bombers filled the horizon, did they finally grasp the scale.
But by then, it was too late. German fighter pilots, once seen as knights of the air, became expendable defenders in a battle they could no longer win by skill alone. American factories were producing engines faster than Germany could train pilots. And the Abwehr had warned them. Ideology versus supply chains. Behind every logistical catastrophe Germany suffered, there sat a report Canaris had forwarded months earlier. Reports describing American steel plants exceeding German output by factors of 10. Rail networks operating without fuel shortages. Agricultural surpluses feeding factories and armies simultaneously. An automotive industry so vast it required its own river ports. Industrial training programs that lifted millions of workers into skilled positions. The Reich ignored all of it. Why? Because accepting American superiority meant shattering the ideological cornerstone that German leadership held sacred. That German racial destiny guaranteed victory. If America outproduced them, then the ideology was false. If the ideology was false, the regime was built on sand. So the reports were branded treasonous. The numbers become visible on the battlefield. By late 1943, the consequences were undeniable. German panzer divisions were fighting with tanks missing critical components because factories couldn't maintain consistent supply. Artillery crews rationed shells because production couldn't keep up. Infantry units lacked radios, boots, even winter clothing. Meanwhile, the Americans were sending entire divisions overseas, fully equipped, with backup equipment waiting on the docks before the 1st Battalion even disembarked. German staff officers spoke privately of a shadow enemy, not the American soldier, but the American factory. Logistics crushed doctrine. The most devastating realization inside German command circles was that even perfect strategy could not overcome the arithmetic.
A panzer division could win 10 battles, but if the Americans could replace their losses 10 times over, while Germany could not replace them at all, victory on the battlefield became irrelevant. Logistics had become destiny. The Abwehr saw this fate clearly, documented it meticulously, and screamed the warnings into a leadership that preferred myth to mathematics. Germany was not defeated by a lack of intelligence. Germany was defeated by its refusal to believe the intelligence it had. And the Ford report, 1.5 million parts per hour, was merely the moment the leadership allowed its own ideology to overpower its last chance at understanding reality.
When the Abwehr delivered the Ford report to Berlin, those staggering figures of 1.5 million parts stamped, cast, milled, riveted, or assembled every hour, the reaction from the Nazi leadership revealed something deeper than strategic denial. It exposed a fundamental technological illiteracy. The Reich simply could not imagine an industrial universe whose logic, scale, and tempo were radically different from its own. The Ford River Rouge complex was not merely a factory. It was a technological ecosystem, a self-contained organism designed to turn raw ore into finished military machinery with breathtaking speed. Ore, coal, rubber, glass, steel, fuel, wiring, precision tools, everything flowed in continuous loops, synchronized like giant mechanical arteries. A barge could arrive with iron ore, and on the same day, trucks could roll out the opposite end built from that ore. To American engineers, this was the natural culmination of assembly line philosophy.
Zu deutschen Liedern, es sounded like sorcery.
Eine Welt definiert von Automation, nicht Craftsmanship. Deutsche industrielle Kultur wurde auf Meisterschaft aufgebaut. Skilled Maschinisten, handfittete Komponenten, Präzision gemessen in Breit als auch in Mikrometern. Das produzierte exzeptionelle Waffen, exquisite Optik, superiore Armor-Alloys, beautifully machined engine parts. Aber diese Meisterwerke kamen schlecht, expensiv und peinlich. Amerikanische Industrie operierte auf einer anderen Äquation. Präzision plus Standardisierung mal Repetition plus Maschinenautomation gleich Scale. Die Formel war elegant, brutal, relentless. Maschinen produzierten Teile, Humans maintained Maschinen. Ingenieure entwickelten Komponenten nicht für Perfektion, sondern für Interchangeability. Ein Jeep-Engine assembled in Toledo worked seamlessly mit einem Replacement-Karburator von Kansas City oder einem Generator von New Jersey. Die Idee von solcher Modularität war alien zum Reich. Deutsche Komponenten oft variierten subtil von Fabrik zu Fabrik.
Even tanks of the same model line, Panther III, Panzer IV, Panther, could possess incompatible spare parts. A Panther transmission built at one plant might not fit perfectly into a Panther chassis built at another. German tanks required artisanal attention. American tanks required none. So when German spies reported that Ford factories used conveyor belts hundreds of meters long, automated stamping presses running at 20,000 hits per day, and motorized tools calibrated to repeat identical work millions of times, Berlin dismissed it as industrial fantasy. Fantasy until Allied armies overran the Western Front with standardized equipment in numbers that defied comprehension. The American concept of flow. What shook the Abwehr most was not just the machinery, but the philosophy. American factories operated on flow, the idea that production moves continuously, without pause, without bottlenecks, without dependence on individual craftsmen.
In Germany, the worker was the core of production. In America, the system was. Ford engineers designed facilities as living diagrams of movement. Steel ingots flowed through rollers, into presses, into assembly bays, into testing stations, then out the door. Every station was timed. Every task had a mechanical rhythm. Supervisors evaluated not individuals, but throughput percentages. Plant managers optimized movement like generals planning offensives. German factories had brilliance. American factories had momentum. Electricity, the silent weapon. A detail that German intelligence noted, but which the Reich failed to grasp, was the U.S. mastery of electrical power. American factories consumed electricity at scales unimaginable in Europe. Entire towns were built around power stations that fed Ford, GM, Douglas, Curtiss-Wright. High voltage lines spanned states like artificial rivers of energy. Massive press lines, automated welding machines, conveyor systems, air tools and machining stations, night shift lighting enabling 24-hour production. German industrial plants, especially after Allied bombing, operated under power shortages so severe that machinery often shut down mid-shift. Technology was not merely enabling American production, it was multiplying it. Statistical control and real-time management. A revolution hidden inside the U.S. production miracle was the use of statistical quality control. American engineers, influenced by mathematicians like Walter Shewhart, implemented statistical monitoring to reduce errors systematically. Thousands of gauges, charts, and control boards tracked production in real time. A deviation of 2 millimeters triggered process correction. A drop in line output triggered team-wide responses. In Germany, inspectors caught flaws after the fact. In America, processes corrected themselves before flaws occurred. The result was a river of parts flowing with uniformity Germany could not replicate. Technology creates tempo. The implications for warfare were staggering.
American tank factories could deliver 500 Shermans in the time it took Germany to repair or refit a single panzer regiment. American aircraft factories produced engines faster than the Luftwaffe could rotate its squadrons. American shipyards produced hulls so predictably that convoy math became a science rather than a gamble. The Abwehr reports described these patterns in excruciating detail. Dozens of pages, hundreds of charts, photographs smuggled from U.S. plants. But the Nazi leadership could not process the meaning. America was waging a technological war, not an ideological one. And Germany was not simply outnumbered. It was outpaced, out-engineered, out-automated, out-electrified, out-logisticked. When technology becomes culture, the hardest truth for German leadership to swallow was that American production wasn't just a technique, it was a cultural force. The U.S. embraced innovation without fear. Immigrant engineers were promoted rather than purged. Women filled technical roles without ideological resistance. Corporations collaborated with universities and the government at a scale Europe had never seen. The Reich derided this as mechanized degeneracy. But mechanized degeneracy built more tanks, trucks, engines, radios, ships, propellers, and munitions than any nation in history. The technological gap becomes a psychological abyss. When the Nazi leadership accused Canaris of treason for reporting Ford's production numbers, it wasn't because the data was implausible. It was because the data proved, mathematically, incontrovertibly, that Nazi ideology had no place in the modern industrial world. The Americans had turned science into production, production into logistics, logistics into strategy, strategy into victory. The Germans had turned ideology into policy, policy into delusion, delusion into blindness, blindness into defeat. To accept the Ford report was to accept that Germany was fighting a 19th century industrial philosophy against a 20th century technological civilization. It was to accept defeat before the war was even half over. By the time the Ford report circulated through the highest levels of the Reich, Germany's defeat was not yet visible on the battlefield, but it was already present in the minds of its leaders. The tragedy was not simply that Nazi officials rejected the Abwehr's intelligence, it was that they lacked the psychological capacity to understand it. They were prisoners of their own ideology, locked inside a worldview that made American industrial superiority not just unlikely, but impossible. And when reality contradicts ideology, totalitarian regimes do not change ideology. They declare reality treason. The ideological filter that distorted the world. Every piece of intelligence that came from the United States passed through the same ideological filter. If the data contradicts racial dogma, the data must be wrong. Nazi racial theory insisted that industrial genius was a racial trait. The Nordic German worker was, according to propaganda, naturally organized, disciplined, and technically gifted. Americans, by contrast, were depicted as lazy consumers, mongrelized by immigration, intellectually undisciplined, and incapable of sustaining high-level technical production. So, when Abwehr agents reported that American factories were running 3 shifts with near-zero absenteeism, the Reich declared it statistically impossible. When they reported that women had replaced male workers in complex machining roles, the Reich dismissed it as propaganda. When they documented how African American workers were operating precision stamping equipment, the Reich declared it biologically absurd. The Nazis had imprisoned themselves in a worldview incapable of seeing the United States clearly. The Abwehr becomes an enemy to its own country, because the Abwehr did not share the party's ideological rigidity, because they believed in numbers, not myths. They were increasingly viewed with suspicion. Canaris's organization was made up of officers who had lived abroad, worked with foreign armies, studied international politics, and understood industrial economics. To Nazi leadership, this made them dangerous. As American production reports became more dire, Nazi paranoia intensified. 1. Why does the Abwehr exaggerate enemy strength? 2. Are they undermining confidence in victory? 3. Are they controlled by defeatists? 4. Is Canaris manipulating intelligence to weaken the Führer's will? The more accurate the intelligence, the more disloyal it appeared. This culminated in a chilling moment during a conference in early 1943, when a party official angrily declared, "If America truly had such production, the war would already be lost." Since the war is not lost, the Abwehr's numbers are lies. In that circular logic, the entire intelligence apparatus was condemned. Ideological inversion, turning weakness into strength. Unable to accept the truth, Nazi leadership inverted it. American industrial mobility was reframed as wastefulness. American mass production was dismissed as low quality. American worker diversity was labeled degeneration. American automation was mocked as soulless mechanics. In speeches to the party elite, U.S. achievements were portrayed as brittle and unsustainable. When the Abwehr produced photographic proof of assembly lines, Nazi propagandists countered with claims that inferior material would cause American weapons to fall apart. This denial had catastrophic consequences. The collapse of strategic decision-making. Every high-level German mistake in 1943-45 can be traced to the same root cause: an inability to process accurate intelligence because ideology made truth illegal. Hitler dismissed warnings about U.S. ship production, so Germany continued submarine strategies doomed by mathematics. Goering dismissed U.S. aircraft output, so the Luftwaffe fought a war it could never hope to sustain. Speer's rational pleas for resource allocation were blocked by doctrines that placed racial theories above industrial necessity. The Abwehr was effectively trying to describe a three-dimensional world to men who insisted the world was flat. And for Canaris personally, this became fatal. His reports were not merely ignored, they became evidence of ideological impurity. Each time he warned Berlin that American production was accelerating, he was seen as weakening morale. Each time he presented hard numbers, he was accused of harboring defeatist sympathies. Each time his agents documented the overwhelming truth, he moved one step closer to the gallows. The human cost of ideological blindness. The psychological toll on German officers was enormous. Frontline commanders watched their tanks immobilized for lack of spare parts, while American units received replacements by the shipload. Luftwaffe pilots watched their squadron mates die faster than aircraft could be built. U-boat crews learned that the Atlantic had turned against them. The Americans simply built ships faster than they could sink them. And slowly, morale cracked. Not because soldiers feared American bravery or tactics, but because they realized the truth their leaders refused to admit. They were fighting a nation whose factories were stronger than their armies. Ideology could not fight physics. The Nazi leadership could lie to itself, but it could not lie to entropy. Steel fatigues, engines fail, rubber wears, ammunition runs dry. America could replace all of it. Germany could replace almost none of it. Hitler believed willpower shaped history. Roosevelt believed supply chains shaped history. Only one of them was right. The final tragedy. When Canaris was eventually arrested, first sidelined, then monitored, then imprisoned, his greatest crime was not espionage. It was not sabotage. It was not treason.
His crime was being correct. He told the truth. He documented reality. He delivered the warnings necessary to save German lives. And for that, the regime destroyed him. The tragedy of Nazi Germany was not simply military defeat. It was cognitive collapse, an ideology so rigid it shattered under the weight of arithmetic. And when the Ford report was labeled treason instead of truth, the fate of the Reich was sealed not by shells or bombs, but by the death of honest intelligence. When historians later examined the collapse of Nazi Germany, they found no shortage of dramatic battles, brilliant maneuvers, and tactical turning points. But beneath these visible events ran a quieter thread, the death of strategic vision, strangled not by enemy action, but by a regime that rejected the very concept of objective truth. At the center of that tragedy stood the Ford Report, a document that should have reshaped the German war effort, but instead became evidence of treason in a system that feared reality more than defeat. The report's figures, 1.5 million parts per hour, were not merely statistics. They were a forecast of the future, a glimpse into the industrial hurricane that would sweep across Europe. They warned that American factories had mastered a level of automation, standardization, and scale unmatched in world history. They predicted that every tank lost by Germany could be replaced 20-fold by the United States. They implied that every German victory on the battlefield was being nullified in real time by production lines humming thousands of miles away. But the Nazi leadership refused to see what the numbers meant. That modern war was no longer determined by elite warriors, or by ideological fervor, or by the destiny of races, but by industrial mathematics. Where the United States treated mass production as a science, Germany clung to an ideology that denied science itself. Where America mobilized millions of workers across racial, regional, and gender lines, Germany limited its labor force by prejudice and dogma. Where American corporations, universities, and government agencies cooperated to redesign factories around efficiency, Germany wasted precious time on political purges, bureaucratic rivalry, and technical infighting. The Abwehr tried to explain this transformation. Canaris tried to warn them. German spies risked their lives to deliver truth to a system that could not comprehend it, and in return the regime punished them for accuracy. The legacy of this failure extended far beyond the war. It became a cautionary tale about how nations collapse, not only from military defeat, but from cognitive rigidity. A government that denies facts becomes unable to strategize. A leadership that rejects intelligence becomes unable to defend itself. A worldview that elevates myth over measurement becomes unable to adapt until it is too late. In the ruins of Berlin, among shattered government files and abandoned ministries, Allied investigators found dozens of Abwehr reports stamped with the same handwritten note. Unreliable, ideologically incompatible. That phrase became the epitaph for the German war effort. What Germany dismissed as impossible had, in fact, been inevitable. The United States would build more ships than U-boats could sink. The United States would build more planes than the Luftwaffe could shoot down. The United States would build more tanks than the Austere could destroy. And the United States would build more trucks than the Wehrmacht could ever hope to fuel. Because the true battlefield was not Kursk or Normandy or the Ardennes. It was the assembly line. The legacy of Ford's production miracle and the intelligence Germany chose to ignore reshaped the post-war world. Nations redefined warfare around industrial capacity. Economies embraced automation, flow, and standardization.
Armies built doctrines around logistical supremacy rather than ideological purity. And intelligence agencies became guardians not just of secrets, but of objective reality. Canaris, executed in the final weeks of the war, never lived to hear Germany admit what was already clear in 1942, that the Abwehr had been right, that the Ford report had been accurate, and that truth, not treason, had been his final act of service. In the end, the tragedy of the Reich was not merely that it lost to superior American production. It was that it could not imagine such production was possible. And when a nation cannot imagine the world as it is doomed, not by its enemies, but by its refusal to see.